29 years of marriage, and I was standing in the back row of Gerald Beckett's funeral, like a stranger who had taken a wrong turn into someone else's story. The chapel at St. Luke's was overflowing, city officials, architects, contractors, even local reporters, all gathered to mourn the man who had redrawn half the skyline of Western Oregon. I'd arrived in my 10-year-old Corolla and parked between two black Teslas. A soft drizzle had started as I stepped out, but I didn't bother with an umbrella. I wasn't there for appearances. I was there for my children. Tessa had called me that morning, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I know you and Dad didn't end on great terms, but can you come? For Nolan and me?" So I came. I wore a plain black dress from Kohl's and no makeup. I sat in the last pew, far from the front row where Whitney Crowley sat draped in designer black, her blonde curls pinned just so, sunglasses perched on her head like she belonged in a movie. She looked like a grieving widow. I looked like what I was, the woman who had been quietly erased. The service was nearly over when Andrew Cole, Gerald's longtime attorney, stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. "Before we close today's service, I'm required by law to acknowledge the reading of Mr. Beckett's final testament." Whitney turned her head, visibly startled. "Per the will dated February 12, 2020, he continued, Gerald Beckett leaves his entire estate, including all business holdings, real estate, and insurance policies to his wife Lorraine Beckett." Silence fell over the room. 200 people turned to look at me. And that's when I realized. Gerald may have left me, but he never removed me. Before Whitney, before the silence, before the courtrooms and signatures, there was a life that felt honest. That life was mine. Gerald and I met during our senior year at Oregon State. He was studying architecture. I was double majoring in English and education. We were young, driven, and full of dreams. He said he fell in love with me the moment I corrected his grammar in front of his drafting classmates. I said I fell in love with the way he really listened when I read aloud lines from East of Eden. By the time we turned 30, we had built what looked like a perfect life. A 2-story home in Maple Grove with a wraparound porch and hydrangeas in the front yard. A chocolate Labrador named Jasper. 2 children, Tessa and Nolan, who made every sacrifice feel like it mattered. Gerald founded More Partners, his architecture firm, in a rented office above a coffee shop. I supported him by teaching full-time at Westbridge High. I made dinner while he drafted blueprints late into the night. I wrote lesson plans at the kitchen table while he practiced his presentations in front of the mirror. We were a team. Our weekends had a rhythm. Saturday mornings meant pancakes in the local farmer's market. Sunday evenings were spent watching old black and white films, our legs tangled on the couch like teenagers who hadn't yet learned to worry. Even during the busy years when Tessa was juggling choir and AP biology, and Nolan was nursing a soccer injury, Gerald always found time for us. He took days off for parent-teacher conferences. He once flew back early from a conference just to catch Tessa's piano recital. We weren't glamorous, but we were real. I wasn't ambitious in the way Gerald was. I didn't need accolades or awards. I found fulfillment in my students' essays, in the way Tessa hugged me after a hard day, in Nolan's lopsided birthday cakes. My world was built from small things done with great love. And for a long time, Gerald seemed to understand that. He used to say, "I couldn't do any of this without you, Lorraine. You're the blueprint beneath everything I've built." I believed him. I believed that being steady was enough. That showing up, staying loyal, loving hard, that all of it mattered. But eventually I would learn something Gerald never said out loud. Even solid foundations can be abandoned if someone decides to build somewhere shinier. I just didn't know back then how replaceable love could be. It was the firm's annual Christmas party in December 2019 that gave me my first glimpse of the unraveling. More Partners always hosted something grand, but that year was extravagant even by Gerald's standards. They rented out the entire top floor of the River Point Hotel, velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, live jazz trio. Gerald told me it was all part of their rebranding. "We're growing, Lorraine. We need to make an impression." I spent a week choosing my dress, settled on a forest green satin gown that Gerald once said brought out the color in my eyes. He smiled politely when he saw me that night. "You look nice," he said, already half scrolling through his phone. The ballroom buzzed with energy. Clients sipped cocktails near the fireplace. Junior architects clustered near the hors d'oeuvres, trying to look confident. I stayed close to Gerald, offering practice smiles, shaking hands, keeping quiet. Then I saw her. She stood near the bar, laughing with a group of men from the marketing team. Tall, blonde, wearing a red dress that shimmered under the lights. Her laugh rang out like she had every right to take up that much space. "That's Madison Tate," Gerald said when he saw me looking. "She's our new branding consultant. Just came in from Chicago. Real sharp. Harvard MBA. She's helping us reposition the firm for national contracts." I nodded. "She seems charismatic." "She's brilliant," he replied, a little too quickly. I noticed something then, something small but unmistakable. The way he looked at her. It was the way he used to look at fresh blueprints or a newly framed house, like it held promise. Potential. Later that evening, I overheard 2 junior associates talking near the dessert table. "Did you hear the way Gerald introduced Madison to the Sinclair investors?" One whispered. "Called her our strategic game changer." "Yeah," the other said. "But when he introduced Lorraine, it was just my wife. Not even head of English at Westbridge. Just Lorraine." The words hit harder than I expected. That night, as we left the hotel, I asked Gerald what he thought of the event. "It was productive," he said. "Madison really knows how to work a room." He didn't ask what I thought. He didn't notice I hadn't touched my dinner. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, I felt like a guest in my own marriage. The changes didn't happen all at once. They crept in like fog, soft, quiet, disorienting. At first, it was just longer hours. Gerald started working late more often, saying Madison had scheduled client strategy meetings that ran past dinner. Then it was weekend site visits that popped up out of nowhere. The man who once guarded family time like a sacred ritual began to treat our routines like inconveniences. He still came home, but something in him didn't. I'd leave his favorite turkey and cheddar sandwich on the counter, only to find it untouched when I cleaned up at night. "We ordered in," he'd say offhandedly. "Madison found this place downtown amazing Thai." Madison found. Those 2 words became the background noise of our home. I'd try to make conversation over dinner, talking about my students, the school's new curriculum, Nolan's upcoming visit. Gerald would nod distractedly, eyes on his phone. "That's nice, honey." "That's nice." He didn't hear me the night I told him I was considering switching to part-time next semester. He didn't react when I mentioned Tessa had won an award for her hospital's patient care initiative. He didn't even flinch when I jokingly said, "I'm thinking of quitting teaching and becoming a circus acrobat." "That's nice, honey." I smiled at the wall behind him. If I didn't, I'd cry. The weekends, once ours, belonged to someone else now. He'd leave early, claiming urgent meetings with developers. I'd make pancakes anyway, eating alone while his voice drifted from the office downstairs, full of laughter and energy tones I hadn't heard directed at me in months. But the final blow came during Tessa's birthday dinner. We'd gone to her favorite bistro to celebrate her new position as senior nurse. She was radiant, glowing with excitement. "Dad, what do you think about the new family liaison program I'm implementing?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Gerald's phone buzzed. He glanced down, typed something quickly. "Sorry, what was that?" Tessa repeated herself. "That's great, sweetheart," he said absently, thumbs still moving. "Madison just sent me the site layout for the Morrison deal. I need to approve it tonight." I watched Tessa's joy deflate like a balloon. And I realized then, he wasn't just ignoring me. He was disappearing from all of us. One unread message at a time. I didn't leave in a blaze of anger. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no grand declarations. I left quietly. It was a Tuesday night in early spring. Tessa had gone back to the city. Nolan was still at school. Gerald was in his office downstairs, on another call with Madison. I stood outside the door for a moment, listening. "You challenge me," he said, his voice low but clear. "Lorraine's a good woman, but she's comfortable. Predictable. You make me better." I didn't cry. I didn't knock. I just turned and walked upstairs. I packed 1 suitcase clothes, my teaching binders, a few framed photos of the kids. I grabbed my birth certificate and passport from the filing cabinet, along with my grandmother's locket and the checkbook for the account he hadn't frozen yet. I wrote a note on the back of a grocery receipt. "I won't be the woman you settle for while you build a future with someone else. I deserve more than being managed kindly. Goodbye." I left it on his pillow. At 6:45 the next morning, I kissed the top of Tessa's sleeping head, wheeled my bag out to the car, and drove away. I didn't have a plan, just a storage unit, a tiny studio apartment across town, and the hope that if I got far enough away, I might hear myself think again. The apartment was barely 500 square feet. A Murphy bed. A kitchenette. Windows that faced a red brick wall. But it was mine. The silence was sharp. No footsteps overhead. No back door slamming. No low murmur of Gerald's voice on calls that didn't involve me. At first, I filled the hours with old movies and tea that went cold too fast. I tried journaling. I deleted half my contacts. I spent an afternoon rearranging 3 pieces of furniture just to feel like I was doing something. I had spent 29 years being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's afterthought. Now, for the first time in a long time, I was just Lorraine. And I had no idea who that even was. It was Tessa who convinced me to clean out the storage unit. "Mom, you're paying $50 a month to store Christmas decorations you haven't touched since 2018, she said one Saturday, placing a grocery bag of fresh fruit on my counter. "Let's just go through it. If nothing else, it'll give you space literally and mentally." The unit sat on the edge of town, a beige metal box nestled between rows of identical beige metal boxes. Unit 311 billion. Inside were cardboard tombs of a former life teolite holders, cookbooks, mismatched plates, and boxes labeled Gerald's office. We made a small workspace near the entrance and started sorting. I was about to toss one entire box into the donation pile when Tessa opened it and pulled out a black leather portfolio. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. I did. Gerald's important documents folder. It used to live in the bottom drawer of his desk. Emergency contacts, legal forms, things we rarely touched. Tessa opened it. "There's something in here with your name on it." She handed me a thick envelope with a law firm's letterhead, Rhodes Avery. Estate Planning Division. My heart thudded as I pulled out the pages. At the top, Last Will and Testament of Gerald Allen Beckett. Dated February 12, 2020. To my beloved wife, Lorraine Beckett, who has been my constant through every challenge and the foundation of every success. I read the words over and over, unable to breathe. Gerald had left me everything: the business, the house, the insurance, the properties. He had never changed his will. Not even after I walked away. "Mom," Tessa said, her voice soft but certain, "this will is still valid. He never updated it." And just like that, a door I thought had closed forever creaked open again. Only this time I wasn't walking back through it as someone's wife. I was stepping forward as someone who finally remembered her worth. We met with Andrew Cole the following Tuesday at a quiet coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. It was the kind of place where time moved slower and people spoke in lowered tones. Andrew spread the will out on the table with the care of someone handling something sacred. "This document," he said, tapping the top corner, "is legally binding. Unless Mr. Beckett filed a newer will with another attorney which, based on our preliminary search, he did not, this remains his final testament." I stared at the signature. The handwriting I knew better than my own. The same loops and flourishes he used when signing birthday cards for the kids. "But we were separated," I said, my voice barely audible. "Separation doesn't void a will," Andrew replied gently. "Only divorce, and your divorce was never finalized. You were still legally married at the time of his death." I glanced at Tessa. Her eyes were already glassy with a strange mix of relief and fury. "Mrs. Beckett," Andrew continued, "if this document stands, you inherit the entirety of his estate, valued conservatively at around $4.5 million, including business assets, real estate, and insurance." The number sounded fictional. But what struck me more was this: Gerald had once seen me, really seen me, in ink, in law, in a statement meant to last beyond life. I sipped my lukewarm coffee and said, "What do I do with this?" Andrew smiled gently. "That depends on what you want, Lorraine." I hadn't been asked that in years. For nearly 3 decades, my wants were footnotes to someone else's plans. But now, with this simple folder on a cafe table, I had the power to rewrite the story. Not just for legal reasons. For my own closure, my own dignity, and maybe, just maybe, my own future. The mediation room at the Pierce County Courthouse was designed to be calming: soft walls, neutral tones, filtered sunlight. But there was nothing calming about sitting across from Gerald for the first time in over 6 months. He wore a navy blue suit that didn't belong to the man I'd once known. It was sleeker, more fitted, paired with a tie that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Madison sat beside him, legs crossed, her expression poised but wary. She didn't smile at me. She didn't need to. Gerald's attorney, a man named Victor Lane, slid a folder across the table. "My client is prepared to offer 40% of his retirement accounts, a cash payout for the house, and 4 years of spousal support," he said smoothly. "Given the circumstances of the separation, we believe this is a generous and equitable resolution." Andrew Cole didn't flinch. He opened our folder with slow, deliberate hands. "Before we consider that," he said, "we'd like to submit some documentation for the record." He began with the will. Then came the financial reports the Beyond lease signed 2 weeks after our separation, the luxury hotel stays billed to more partners, the business line of credit opened without board approval. Then, the photo. Gerald and Madison at a black tie charity event, captioned "Power Couple of Design and Branding," dated just 10 days after our mediation began. Madison's hand tightened around Gerald's arm. Gerald shifted in his seat, the way he used to when Nolan asked questions he didn't want to answer. Victor cleared his throat. "We're not here to litigate personal matters." "No," Andrew said, "we're here to ensure Lorraine receives what she's legally and ethically owed." Then, for the first time, Gerald spoke. "What do you want, Lorraine?" he asked, quieter than I expected. I met his eyes, those same eyes that once watched our children sleep, that used to search for me across crowded rooms. "I want recognition," I said, "not revenge, not pity, just acknowledgement that I mattered. That our life mattered, that I wasn't just background noise in your success story." He said nothing. And in his silence I heard everything. The mediation adjourned without agreement. But for the first time since I'd left, I walked out of that room standing taller. Because I wasn't asking to be seen anymore. I was demanding it. 3 weeks later, I found myself back in that same silence, but this time, it was in the sanctuary of St. Luke's, surrounded by polished caskets and polite grief. Gerald had died suddenly of a heart attack. 56 years old, a man who had once been so full of plans, meetings, presentations, trips, and now gone. The funeral was exactly what I expected. Expensive, elegant, curated. Madison had spared no detail. White lilies everywhere. A string quartet playing Vivaldi. A slideshow of Gerald's professional milestones flashing silently across a screen. I stood in the back again, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to our mediation. Not out of spite, just convenience. People whispered when they saw me, some with sympathy, others with judgment. But I didn't care. Because I knew what was coming. Andrew Cole stepped up to the podium near the end of the service, a familiar folder in his hands. "Per legal requirement," he began, "I am here to acknowledge the last will and testament of Gerald Allen Beckett, dated February 12, 2020. All heads turned. Madison's posture stiffened. Andrew's voice remained calm. "Mr. Beckett's estate, including all business holdings, property, investment accounts, and life insurance, has been legally designated to his wife, Lorraine Beckett." Gasps rippled through the pews. Madison's expression collapsed in real time. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked around for support. For someone to challenge what had just been said. No one did. Andrew continued. "This includes more partners, the residents on Oak Hill Lane, commercial properties in downtown Portland, and life insurance policies totaling $2.2 million. It was not just money, it was everything. Madison had built her future on a man who never legally made her part of it. After the service, as people filtered out with lowered voices and sideways glances, Madison approached me. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "We had a life together." I looked at her, the woman who once stood between my past and my peace. "No," I said, calm and quiet. "You had his attention. I had his commitment. And that was the difference. He had tried to erase me. But in the end, he left behind the one truth he couldn't rewrite. I was still his wife. And I had the paperwork to prove it. By September, I'd moved back into the house on Oak Hill Lane. My house now. entirely, legally, unquestionably mine. But it no longer looked like the place Gerald and I had shared. I stripped away the cold grays and sleek metals Madison had installed, replaced them with warm colors, soft light, and bookshelves that wrapped around the living room like old friends. The kitchen was mine again, too, rebuilt from memory. The copper kettle returned to its rightful spot, the recipe cards from my mother taped back inside the cabinet doors. I didn't restore the past. I redefined it. One Saturday morning, I was reading student essays in my new sunroom when the doorbell rang. It was Miriam Beckett, Gerald's mother. She stood on the porch clutching a small leather purse, her expression unsure. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. We sat over Earl Grey tea. She looked around, taking in the changes. The lighter curtains. The framed photos of Nolan and Tessa. The absence of Gerald's presence. "It feels like you," she finally said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "Madison's trying to contest the will," she said. "She keeps calling me. Thinks I can sway you." I waited. "I told her," Miriam said, her voice cracking, that if Gerald had wanted her in his future, he would have made it legal. But he didn't. And I'm done pretending otherwise. I nodded slowly. She placed a hand over mine. "You were always the one who understood him, even when he forgot how to understand himself." That afternoon, as she left, I realized the house wasn't just mine by deed. It was mine in spirit. That fall, I returned to teaching. Room 214 at Westbridge High still smelled like dry erase markers and teenage anxiety, but I stood at the front of the class with something I hadn't felt in years: confidence. One student asked me why Gatsby couldn't let go of the past. "Because he thought the past was where he left his worth," I said, "but real value doesn't live back there. It lives in who you become after everything breaks." I wasn't the wife anymore. I wasn't the ex-wife either. I was Lorraine Beckett. Whole, present, and finally visible. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the earth itself needed time to thaw. In April, I sat in the garden behind my house, Gerald's former fortress, now my sanctuary, watching the tulips open one cautious petal at a time. The same soil where I'd once planted geraniums with Tessa now bloomed under my hands again. Familiar, forgiving. The past no longer held me hostage. That month, Tessa and I booked our first trip abroad together. Italy, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting but never prioritized. There had always been a meeting, a deadline, a business dinner. Now there was only possibility. Before the flight, I stopped by the school to submit my leave form. 2 weeks off. My first vacation in years that wasn't tethered to someone else's schedule. "Good for you, Lorraine," Mrs. Henry, the school secretary, said as she stamped the paperwork. "You deserve it." It was a simple sentence, but for someone who had spent decades waiting for permission to take up space, it meant everything. On the plane, Tessa leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "You seem different." "I feel different," I said. "Stronger?" "No," I smiled, "just unafraid." When we landed in Florence, I didn't check email. I didn't scroll through court updates. I didn't think once about Madison Tate or Gerald's will. Instead, I walked cobbled streets, sipped espresso under cathedral shadows, and laughed harder than I had in years. I wasn't running from anything anymore. Because the truth is, Gerald didn't just leave me a business or a house or a bank account. He left me proof. Proof that my life had mattered, even when he'd forgotten. Proof that showing up, loving consistently, and giving without drama had weight. And most of all, he left me the space to reclaim the one thing I hadn't realized I'd lost. Myself. Now, every morning I wake up in a home filled with music, quiet joy, and fresh coffee brewed just the way I like it. Not because someone else expects it, but because I chose